The night, everything changed. They sat in total darkness, 47 Japanese women clutching broken chair legs and sharpened spoons, listening to American boots getting closer. They knew what was coming. Every radio broadcast, every officer, every newspaper had told them the same thing. American soldiers were monsters. They would torture, they would violate, they would show no mercy to women. So when the door finally opened on that freezing October night in 1945, they braced for hell itself. But the Americans weren't holding rifles, they were holding blankets. If this story shakes you to your core, hit that subscribe button now. Because what happened next will completely destroy everything you think you know about war. The island of Saipan smelled like death. Smoke still twisted up from bombed-out bunkers. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. And hidden in the wreckage, American Marines had just discovered something they weren't expecting. 47 Japanese women in military uniforms, starving, terrified, and certain they were about to die. These weren't random civilians. They were military auxiliaries, nurses, radio operators, clerks. Women who'd served the Japanese Empire and now faced capture by the enemy they'd been taught to fear more than death itself. Their uniforms were shredded. Their faces were hollow from weeks hiding in caves, eating roots and weeds. Some had burns. Others had infected wounds that hadn't been treated in months. And every single one of them had the same look in their eyes. The blank stare of people who'd already accepted they were dead. When the Marines finally broke through the rubble to reach them, the women screamed. Some tried to run. Others froze. And one older woman, Ko, who'd been a head nurse, stepped forward with her hands raised, shouting in rapid Japanese that nobody understood. What happened next would haunt these women for the rest of their lives. They loaded them onto military trucks, 47 enemy combatants, cramped in the back, gripping the sides as the vehicles bounced over cratered roads. Through gaps in the canvas, they saw the devastation. Palm trees ripped to splinters, entire villages turned to ash, Japanese bodies still rotting in the sun. One young woman named Yuki turned away and vomited over the side. The 20-minute ride felt like hours. When they finally stopped, work lights flooded the truck bed, blinding them. American soldiers stood everywhere, watching. The women climbed down on shaking legs, two so weak they had to be carried. And then they saw it. A long wooden building surrounded by barbed wire. A prisoner of war camp. This is where it ends, they thought. This is where the torture begins. But here's where the story takes its first impossible turn. Years of propaganda had filled their heads with nightmares. American soldiers torture prisoners. American soldiers have no honor. American soldiers do unspeakable things to women. Every Japanese citizen knew what capture meant. Death would be a mercy compared to what came first. As they lined up outside the barracks, Ko whispered to the women nearest her in Japanese, "Stay together. Be strong. Remember, you are daughters of Japan." Some of the younger women started crying. Others stared straight ahead, jaws clenched, trying to show dignity in their final moments. Then an American officer approached with a translator, a Japanese-American soldier who looked deeply uncomfortable. The officer spoke. The translator relayed, "You will be processed. You will be given medical attention. You will be housed here." Simple words. Businesslike. Empty of threat. But the women didn't believe a single syllable. Words are easy, actions tell the truth. And they knew what actions were coming. Except they were wrong about everything. They expected immediate violence, immediate degradation. Instead, they were being spoken to calmly, directed with gestures instead of shoved with rifle butts. The cognitive dissonance was almost more terrifying than brutality would have been. What were the Americans waiting for? They took them into the building one at a time. The waiting was torture. Each woman who disappeared through that door might never come back. Those still outside whispered prayers, held hands, and tried not to imagine what was happening inside. When Yuki's turn came, her legs nearly gave out. She was 22, had worked as a radio operator, and was now walking toward what she believed would be her assault or execution. 2 female American nurses met her inside. Female nurses. Yuki stopped, completely confused. The nurses smiled gently and gestured for her to sit. Through the translator, they explained they needed to examine her for injuries and illness. The exam was clinical, professional, gentle. They cleaned the infected cut on her arm, checked her eyes, throat, lungs. When they found severe malnutrition, one nurse made notes while the other squeezed Yuki's shoulder sympathetically. Nobody hit her. Nobody touched her inappropriately. Nobody even raised their voice. When it was over, they handed her a cup of water and told her to drink slowly. Yuki drank with hands shaking so badly that water spilled down her chin. She kept waiting for the trap to spring, for the kindness to reveal itself as mockery. It never came, and that's when everything she'd ever been taught started to crumble. One by one, every woman went through the same process: medical exams, gentle treatment, professional care. Each emerged looking dazed, confused, almost disappointed in a strange way. Their expectations of horror had been denied, leaving them floating in terrible uncertainty. Ko came out last. She'd steeled herself to endure the worst with dignity. Instead, an American doctor had treated her knee injury, which had been causing her agony for weeks, with the care of a professional. After the medical exams, they were directed to another room. Inside stood large metal tubs filled with water. Steam rose from them. Hot water for bathing. The women stared in disbelief, searching for the humiliation they expected. But the nurses simply handed them soap and towels and told them to wash. The soap was white, industrial, nothing like the delicate soaps from home, but it was real. It smelled clean. Yuki picked up a bar and turned it over in her hands. She hadn't been truly clean in over a month. None of them had. They undressed awkwardly, trying to maintain modesty. The hot water was almost painful at first, scalding against sensitive skin. But as they sank into it, as the heat worked into their exhausted muscles, some of the women began to weep, not from fear, from relief, so intense it hurt. After bathing, they received clean cotton clothes. Not uniforms, not prison rags, just plain shirts and pants, whole and clean. Then they were led to a mess hall. The smell hit them before they even entered. Rice. Real rice. Not the mixture of barley and weeds they'd been surviving on. Real white rice. The mess hall was a large tent with wooden tables. American soldiers ate on one side. A section had been cleared for the Japanese women. They sat slowly, watching the Americans for any sign of mockery. The soldiers mostly ignored them, focused on their own meals. Then the food came. White rice, steaming and fluffy. Grilled fish. Miso soup, clearly made by someone who knew Japanese cooking. Pickled vegetables. And hot green tea served in simple cups. The women stared as if it were a mirage. Ko picked up her chopsticks with trembling hands. She hadn't seen a full meal like this in 6 months. Rations on Saipan had dwindled to almost nothing. 3 women in their unit had died of starvation before the surrender. She took a bite of rice. The texture, the taste, the warmth. It flooded her senses. She closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. Around her, other women began to eat. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate frantically, as if the food would be taken away. A few couldn't eat at all, too overwhelmed by the contradiction. How could the enemy know how to make miso soup? How could the enemy care enough to try? One of the younger women, Michiko, 19 years old, former typist, suddenly dropped her chopsticks. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The sound echoed through the tent. American soldiers looked over, concerned. A female nurse approached and knelt beside Michiko, speaking softly in English that Michiko couldn't understand. The translator came over. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" Michiko shook her head, unable to speak. Ko answered for her in Japanese. "She's confused. We were told you would hurt us. Instead, you feed us." The translator relayed this to the nurse, whose face showed something like sadness. She patted Michiko's shoulder and stood up, leaving them to their meal. But the damage was done. The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. What if everything we were told was a lie? As darkness fell, they were taken to their barracks. Simple wooden structure, raised off the ground, screens on the windows. Inside, rows of cots, each with a thin mattress, pillow, and folded blanket. After months of sleeping on cave floors, the sight of actual beds made several women stop in the doorway. Yuki sat on hers and tested the mattress. It was thin, military issue, nothing luxurious. But it was a bed. She lay back, felt the pillow under her head, and stared at the ceiling. An American guard, a young corporal who looked barely 20, brought in a kerosene lamp and hung it from a hook. He said something in English nobody understood, paused as if trying to think what to say, then just nodded and left. Pulling the door closed behind him, but not locking it, they heard his footsteps fade away. Silence fell over the barracks. Ko broke the silence. We should take turns staying awake, to keep watch. Several women murmured agreement. They organized shifts, 4 women awake at a time while the others attempted sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound outside made them tense. Footsteps approaching then passing by. Voices in English. A truck starting up. Each noise could be a threat. Yuki lay with her eyes open, watching shadows move across the ceiling as the lamp flame flickered. Around midnight, they heard footsteps approaching. Multiple people. The women who were supposed to be sleeping sat up. Hearts pounding. This was it. Whatever the Americans had been planning, it was happening now, in the darkness, when they were isolated and vulnerable. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Ko stood up, face set with determination. If they were coming for the women, they'd have to go through her first. Others quietly picked up anything that could serve as a weapon. A shoe, a belt. One woman had hidden a sharp piece of metal. They waited, barely breathing. The door handle turned. The door opened. 3 Americans stood there. 2 soldiers and a female nurse, carrying bundles in their arms. The nurse spoke. The translator's voice came from behind her. The temperature drops at night. We brought extra blankets. And tea. They walked in slowly, non-threateningly, and began placing wool blankets on empty cots. One soldier carried a large thermos and stack of cups. The women stared, their makeshift weapons forgotten. Blankets. Hot tea. The nurse smiled at them, a genuine smile with no trace of mockery, and poured tea into cups, handing them out. "Sleep well," the translator said. Then they left, closing the door quietly behind them. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Michiko started laughing. It was a strange, almost hysterical laugh. "Blankets," she said in Japanese. "They brought us blankets." Other women began to laugh too, the sound mixing with crying, a release of tension so powerful it left them shaking. Yuki picked up one of the blankets and wrapped it around her shoulders. Thick, warm, smelling faintly of storage and mothballs. She held her cup of tea in both hands, feeling the heat seep into her palms. This was real. This was actually happening. The enemy had brought them blankets and tea. That night marked a turning point. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something. The women slept more soundly than they had in months, wrapped in American blankets, in American beds, behind American guards who didn't hurt them. It was confusing and frightening in its own way, but it was also undeniably real. Morning came with the sound of a bell. The women woke slowly, disoriented. Sunlight streamed through screened windows. The door opened. The same young corporal from the night before gestured for them to come out. Breakfast was served in the mess tent. Rice porridge, fish, pickles, hot tea. More food than they'd seen in months. After breakfast, they were organized into work groups. Through the translator, they learned they'd be assigned to help with laundry, cleaning, food preparation. Light work. They'd be paid in camp script that could be used at a small canteen. The work was indeed light. Yuki was assigned to laundry, washing sheets and towels in large tubs. The work was mundane, repetitive, oddly comforting. It gave her something to focus on besides confusion and fear. The American soldiers they worked alongside were mostly polite, sometimes awkward. Many were young, barely older than the Japanese women. They communicated through gestures and simple words. One soldier, tall from somewhere called Minnesota, tried to teach Yuki the English word for soap. He pointed at it, said soap several times, then grinned when she repeated it back. It was such a normal human interaction that it left Yuki feeling off balance for hours. Days turned into routine. Wake at dawn, breakfast, work detail, lunch, more work, dinner, evening in the barracks. The sameness was both reassuring and unsettling. Where was the cruelty they'd expected? Where was the degradation? The Americans treated them like prisoners of war. Not honored guests, but not monsters either. Just prisoners to be housed and fed according to rules the women didn't fully understand. The camp had a small canteen where prisoners could buy items with work script. The first time the women were allowed to visit, they approached it like explorers entering unknown territory. Inside, shelves held items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, pencils, toothbrushes, combs. Ko stood in front of the chocolate display, staring. Real chocolate. American chocolate wrapped in bright paper. The price was listed in script, affordable after a week of work. She picked up a bar, feeling its weight, its realness. In Japan, chocolate had become impossible to find years ago. Everything had been rationed more, then disappeared entirely. And here, in a prisoner of war camp, she could buy chocolate. She bought the bar and saved it. That night, she broke off a single square and let it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. She thought of her daughter in Tokyo, now 7, who'd never tasted chocolate. She thought of her husband, if he was still alive, fighting somewhere in China, or maybe already dead. She thought of her city, burned and starving. And here she was, eating American chocolate in an American prison. The contradiction was eating her alive. Letters began to arrive, not from home. Those connections had been severed. But between the women themselves. The Americans provided paper and pencils. Some younger women began keeping diaries in Japanese that nobody else could read. Yuki wrote every night by lamplight, her hand moving across the paper in characters that felt like home. She wrote about the contradictions. How the food was better than what she'd eaten even before the war became desperate. How Americans sometimes smiled at them, offered cigarettes, treated them with casual friendliness that felt more insulting than hostility would have been. How dare they be kind? How dare they make this easy? But no letters came from Japan. No news of families, cities, the war's end. The women existed in an information bubble, knowing only what Americans told them through the translator. The war is over. Japan surrendered. Your country is occupied. The emperor spoke on the radio. These facts felt unreal, impossible. Japan had never been occupied. Japan had never surrendered. The emperor's voice had never been heard by common people. And yet, here they were, fed and housed by the enemy, alive when they should be dead. The cognitive dissonance grew worse, not better. Michiko voiced what many were thinking one evening. Why are they doing this? What do they want from us? Ko, older and more experienced, said quietly, maybe they don't want anything. Maybe this is just what they do. The idea was almost more frightening than malice. If the Americans treated prisoners well not for gain, but simply because of rules, what did that say about everything they'd been taught? What did it say about their own nation's treatment of prisoners? Some women refused to accept it. They remained suspicious, waiting for the trap. They hoarded food, hid small items that could be used as weapons, spoke to Americans as little as possible. But even their resistance was wearing thin. It's hard to maintain hatred against someone who brings you blankets at night. The breakthrough came in small moments. A guard named Roberts, who spoke a few words of Japanese from a phrasebook, tried to make jokes. They were terrible jokes, lost in translation. But he smiled so genuinely when he mangled the pronunciation that some women couldn't help but smile back. Smiling at the enemy. It felt like betrayal. The female nurse, Captain Morrison, took particular interest in the women's welfare. She checked on them daily, asked about their health, arranged for medicine when needed. One day Ko's knee injury flared up badly, making it hard to walk. Captain Morrison noticed immediately and had her sent to the camp medical facility. There, An American doctor examined her, took x-rays, prescribed anti-inflammatory medication. The x-ray machine was frightening and miraculous. Ko lay still as images were taken of her bones. The doctor showed her the pictures, pointing to where the joint was damaged. He prescribed rest, medication, physical therapy. All of this, the examination, the x-rays, the treatment, was provided freely, as if she were a person who mattered rather than an enemy prisoner. Yuki had her own moment of connection while hanging laundry. One afternoon she heard music. An American soldier sat on building steps playing a harmonica. The tune was sad and sweet, something about home. Yuki knew the feeling in the music even though she didn't know the song. She stopped working and listened. The soldier noticed her and paused. Then he started playing again, watching her face. When he finished, he smiled and said something in English. Yuki didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Music transcends language. She bowed slightly, a habit from home, and he laughed, not mockingly, but with pleasure. Then he played another song, this one more upbeat, and she found herself humming along. These small interactions accumulated. A shared cigarette, a guard helping carry a heavy basket, an American showing pictures of his family, his mother, sisters, dog, all the way back in Iowa. The pictures were worn from being carried in his pocket. He looked at them with such obvious homesickness that Michiko felt a pang of recognition. He missed home the same way she missed hers. The realization was deeply uncomfortable. One evening, American soldiers organized a movie night. A screen was set up in the camp yard. A projector showed American films. The Japanese women were invited to attend. Most went, curious despite themselves. The film was in English, which they didn't understand, but it was a comedy and physical humor translated. Women who hadn't laughed in months found themselves giggling at a man slipping on a banana peel, at a chase scene through a department store. Afterward, walking back to barracks, the women were quiet. Something had shifted. They'd spent an evening being entertained by their captors, laughing at American humor, sharing space with American soldiers without fear. It felt like crossing a line they hadn't meant to cross. Yuki lay awake in her cot, staring at the ceiling. 2 months had passed since capture. 2 months of regular meals, clean water, work that didn't break them. Americans who treated them with strange professionalism and casual kindness. Her body had responded to the change. She'd gained weight. Her skin had cleared. Her hair was shiny again. She looked healthier than she had in years. This physical restoration should have been relief. Instead, it felt like betrayal. She was a prisoner of war. She was supposed to be suffering. The emperor had asked his people to endure hardship, sacrifice everything for Japan. And here she was, growing fat on American rice, sleeping in American beds, laughing at American movies. She thought about Tokyo, about her family. Were they eating? Did they have shelter? Her father would be devastated by defeat. He'd been so proud when she joined the military auxiliary, so certain Japan would prevail. What would he think if he could see her now, healthy and fed by the enemy? The contradiction gnawed at her constantly. She'd been taught Americans were barbaric, had no honor, no respect. But everything she experienced contradicted this. The Americans had rules. They followed protocols. They treated prisoners according to international agreements she'd never heard of before capture. When someone was sick, they provided medical care. When someone was cold, they provided blankets. But if the propaganda about Americans was false, what else had been false? The question terrified her. She'd built her entire understanding of the war, of her role, of her duty, on the foundation of that propaganda. If the foundation crumbled, what was left? She wrote in her diary, characters flowing across the page. I don't know who I am anymore. I was a Japanese woman, loyal to the emperor, ready to die for my country. Now I'm a prisoner who eats American food and sleeps in American blankets, and feels grateful for both. Is this what defeat means? Not death, but the slow dissolution of everything you believed. Other women wrestled with similar conflicts. Michiko, the youngest, seemed almost to embrace the new reality. She learned English phrases quickly, smiled at guards, adapted with the flexibility of youth. But even she had moments of doubt. Times when she'd fall silent and stare into the distance, clearly thinking of home and family. Ko carried the burden differently. As the oldest, she felt responsible for maintaining their dignity, their identity as Japanese women. She insisted they continue certain rituals, bowing to each other in the morning, speaking Japanese among themselves, maintaining hierarchies of age and rank. These small acts of cultural preservation were her way of resisting the slow erosion of identity. But even Ko felt the pull of gratitude toward their captors. When Captain Morrison arranged for her knee treatment, when the American doctor spent an hour carefully explaining her condition through a translator, when the physical therapist worked patiently to restore mobility, these acts of care chipped away at her certainty. One night she gathered the women for a meeting. They sat in a circle in the barracks, speaking in low voices. "We must remember who we are," Ko said. "We must not forget Japan. We must not forget our duty." But even as she spoke, her words felt hollow. Duty to what? A war that was over. An empire that had surrendered. A government that had sent them to die on a remote island and then forgotten them. The debates in the barracks grew more intense. Not arguments exactly, but discussions that touched on increasingly uncomfortable questions. How should they feel about their captivity? What did they owe to Japan? What did survival mean in the context of total defeat? One evening, a woman named Aiko, who'd been a nurse, said what many were thinking but few dared voice. "They treat us better than our own officers did." The statement hung in the air. It was true. Many women had experienced harsh treatment from Japanese officers during the war. Military discipline had been brutal, especially for women who were seen as somehow less than real soldiers, even as they were expected to sacrifice everything. Michiko added, "My commander hit me once for a small mistake in a report, with his fist. I had a bruise for 2 weeks." She touched her cheek at the memory. None of these Americans have hit any of us. Not once. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The enemy, the supposed barbarians, showed more restraint and humanity than their own military had. But not everyone accepted this conclusion. A woman named Sato, rigid and traditional, spoke up sharply. "You forget yourself. Japanese officers were preparing us for sacrifice, for ultimate service to the emperor. American softness is not kindness, it's weakness. They treat us well because they have no honor, no understanding of duty." Her words carried the weight of old ideology, the beliefs they'd all shared once. Yet even Sato's convictions seemed to waver sometimes. When she fell ill with fever, it was Captain Morrison who sat with her through the night, bringing cold compresses, monitoring her temperature, ensuring she received antibiotics. Sato recovered. Afterward, she was quieter in her denunciations, her certainty visibly shaken. The women began to share stories of life before capture, of the war years, of the tightening grip of militarism on daily life. They spoke of rationing that went from inconvenient to devastating, of air raids that destroyed whole neighborhoods, of family members sent to war who never returned, of constant propaganda telling them to sacrifice more, endure more, believe more. And they spoke of the lies. The government had said Japan was winning, even as defeat became obvious. Officials had said Americans would torture prisoners, even though that hadn't happened. Leaders had called for civilians to fight to the death rather than surrender, promising a glorious end that was really just death. How many other pronouncements had also been lies? Yuki found herself thinking about the emperor's radio address, which they'd heard about but not heard themselves. The voice of God they'd been taught, speaking directly to his people for the first time ever. And he'd told them to surrender, to accept defeat, to endure the unendurable. If the emperor himself could change course so completely, what did that mean for all the sacrifices that had come before? These discussions were dangerous, touching on thoughts that could have gotten them killed just months before. But here in this strange American prison, they were free to question. No thought police listened in. No military police would drag them away for disloyalty. The irony was painful. They were prisoners. And yet they had more freedom to think and speak than they'd ever had as supposedly free citizens of Imperial Japan. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. There was no single moment of realization, but rather an accumulation of small truths that eventually became undeniable. The Americans were not monsters. Their own government had lied to them. The war had been lost not because of insufficient sacrifice, but because it had been unwinnable from the start. And survival, mere survival, was not shameful. One afternoon, American soldiers organized a baseball game and invited the Japanese women to watch. Baseball had been played in Japan before the war, though the government had tried to suppress it as too Western. Now, sitting on benches in the tropical sun, the women watched Americans play this familiar yet foreign game. Some soldiers tried to explain the rules using gestures and the few Japanese words they'd learned. When one team scored, half the watching women cheered along with the Americans before catching themselves. They had cheered for an American team in an American game while being held as American prisoners. The absurdity of it made Michiko laugh out loud. Once she started, others joined in. They laughed at themselves, at the situation, at the strangeness of the world they now inhabited. Ko watched the younger women laughing and felt complex emotions. Relief that they could still laugh, sadness at what their laughter represented, a letting go of old certainties, and underneath it all, growing acceptance that perhaps this letting go was necessary for survival. Not just physical survival, but the survival of their humanity, their ability to find joy even in captivity. The most profound moment came when Captain Morrison showed them a film. Not a Hollywood comedy this time, but news footage of Japan. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo. The cities were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. The footage showed survivors wandering through ruins, children with burns, women searching for family members. The atomic bombs, the firebombing, the complete destruction. The women watched in silence, many crying openly. This was what their homeland looked like now. This was what the war had done. Yuki thought of her neighborhood in Tokyo and felt certain it was gone. All of it. Her home, her school, the shops she'd known since childhood. All turned to ash by American bombs. But the Americans sitting around them watching the same footage didn't look triumphant. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked sad. One young soldier got up and left, his face pale. They were not celebrating the destruction. They were showing it to the prisoners not as a boast, but as information, as context, as truth. After the film ended, Captain Morrison spoke through the translator. "The war is over. Japan is being rebuilt. Your families, if they survived, are receiving aid, American aid, food, medicine, supplies. We are not your friends, but we are no longer your enemies. We are all just people trying to survive what happened." The words were simple, but they carried weight. That night, the women talked late into the evening about home, about what they'd find when they returned, about whether they could return, whether there was anything to return to. And underneath all of it, unspoken but understood, was a new realization. The war had destroyed Japan, but the peace was being built by the very people they'd been taught to see as devils. American food was feeding Japanese children. American medicine was treating Japanese wounded. American engineers were helping rebuild Japanese cities. The ideology they'd been raised with, Japan as superior, Americans as barbarians, war as glorious, had been shattered as completely as the cities in that film. What would they build in its place? That was the question that kept them awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds of the American camp outside their barracks. The turning point came on a cold December evening, 3 months after their capture. A storm had moved in, bringing rain and unusual cold to the tropical island. The barracks, designed for heat, provided little protection against the chill. The women huddled under their blankets, shivering, trying to stay warm as rain hammered the roof. Around 8 p.m., they heard vehicles pulling up outside. Then voices, American voices, speaking urgently. The women tensed. Why were Americans coming now? In the storm? In the dark? The old fears resurfaced immediately. This was the moment they'd been waiting for all along. The kindness had been a trick, and now the truth would be revealed. The door burst open. 3 soldiers entered, soaked from rain. They carried large bundles. Behind them came Captain Morrison and 2 nurses, also drenched. The translator rushed in last, shaking water from his jacket. "There's a problem with the heating system in this building," the translator said. "It can't be fixed until morning. We're moving you to another barracks with working heat. Please gather your things quickly." The women scrambled to collect their few possessions. This seemed real, a practical response to a practical problem. But the old suspicion remained. Where were they really being taken? They were led through rain to a larger barracks building closer to the main camp. Inside, it was warm. A potbelly stove glowed in the corner, radiating heat. The bunks here were better, with thicker mattresses. On each bunk lay 2 blankets instead of 1. And at the foot of each bed was a small package wrapped in brown paper. Captain Morrison spoke. The translator relayed. "We apologize for the inconvenience. The packages contain warm socks, an extra shirt, and some personal items. We also brought hot soup and tea." As if on cue, 2 soldiers wheeled in a cart with a large pot of soup, stacks of bowls, a container of hot tea. The women stood frozen, water dripping from their clothes onto the wooden floor. This was not a trick. This was genuine care in response to genuine need. The Americans had noticed they were cold and moved them to warmth. They'd provided not just necessities, but comforts. Extra blankets, warm clothes, hot food on a cold night. Yuki felt something break inside her. Not break exactly, more like a wall crumbling, a resistance giving way. She sat on the nearest bunk and opened her package. Inside, thick wool socks, a flannel shirt, a comb, a bar of soap, and a small chocolate bar. Such simple things. Such thoughtful things. She picked up the chocolate and started to cry. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Michiko clutched her new socks and wept. Aiko held the flannel shirt to her face, feeling its softness. Even Ko, always controlled, sat with her head bowed, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sato, the most resistant, the one who'd insisted longest that American kindness was weakness, stared at her package and whispered, "Why? Why do they do this?" Captain Morrison moved among them, her face showing concern. She didn't need translation to understand what was happening. She'd seen it before. This moment when prisoners stopped seeing their captors as the enemy and started seeing them as people. It was always emotional, always difficult, always necessary for healing to begin. The women ate their soup, drank their tea, slowly warmed up. They changed into dry clothes and the new shirts they'd been given. They put on wool socks and felt their feet finally grow warm. And as they settled into their new bunks under extra blankets, in the warmth of the heated barracks, something fundamental shifted. Yuki wrote in her diary that night, her hand steadier than it had been in weeks. "Tonight I understood something. The Americans don't treat us well because they're weak. They treat us well because they believe it's right. They have rules about how to treat prisoners. And they follow those rules even when it would be easier not to. Even when we're the enemy. Even when we might not deserve it. This is not weakness. This is something else. Something I don't have a word for in Japanese." The word she was looking for was humanity. Not the humanity that exists between friends or family, but the humanity that extends even to strangers, even to enemies. The recognition that even in war, certain things remain sacred. Dignity, basic care, the acknowledgement that suffering should be minimized even when it can't be eliminated. That night, for the first time since capture, none of the women kept watch. They all slept. Truly slept. Warm and fed and safe. As 1946 began, word spread through the camp that repatriation would begin soon. The Japanese prisoners would be sent home. This should have been joyous news. Instead, it filled many women with dread. Home no longer meant what it once had. Home was destroyed cities. Home was starvation and occupation. Home was facing people who'd suffered while they'd been fed. Yuki thought constantly about her family. If they'd survived the firebombing, what would they think of her when she returned? She'd gained weight. Her face was full and healthy. Her hair was clean and shiny. She looked better than she had before the war. How could she face people who'd nearly starved while she ate American rice? And there was more than guilt. There was fear of leaving the security they'd found. Life in the camp was simple, predictable, safe. They knew what to expect. They knew they'd be fed, housed, treated fairly. What awaited them in Japan? Chaos, starvation, judgment from neighbors who might see them as traitors for surviving in enemy hands. Some women confessed they didn't want to leave. Michiko said it out loud one evening. "I'm afraid to go home." The admission hung in the air, shameful and honest. Ko nodded slowly. "I understand. But we must. Japan is our home. No matter what we find there, we must return and help rebuild." Her words were brave, but her voice shook. She was afraid too. The Americans began processing them for departure. Medical exams, documentation, lists, and forms. Captain Morrison met with each woman individually, asking about their health, ensuring they were fit to travel, providing medicine for those who needed it. To Yuki, she said through the translator, "You will face difficulties at home, but you're strong. You survived the war. You survived us. You will survive what comes next." It was oddly comforting, this reassurance from her former captor. The day of departure arrived. The women gathered their few possessions, clothes they'd been given, small items bought at the canteen, their diaries and letters. Many guards came to see them off. Roberts, who'd tried so hard to learn Japanese, gave them a clumsy bow and said "sayonara" with his terrible accent. Some women laughed, some cried. Michiko hugged him impulsively, breaking all protocol, and he awkwardly patted her shoulder. Captain Morrison presented each woman with a small package: soap, toothbrush, comb, chocolate. "For the journey," she said. "Practical items, but also a reminder of everything that had passed between them." Ko accepted her package and bowed deeply, formally, in the Japanese way. Captain Morrison bowed back, not quite right, but sincere. The ship that would take them home was waiting at the dock. As they boarded, Yuki turned to look back at the camp. It had been her prison. It had also been her sanctuary. The contradictions would never be fully resolved. She would carry them for the rest of her life. The voyage back to Japan took 2 weeks. The women had time to think, to prepare themselves for what they'd find. They shared their fears and hopes in long conversations on deck. They made promises to stay in touch, though they knew the chaos of post-war Japan might make that impossible. They became not just fellow prisoners, but something deeper. Survivors who shared a truth no one else would understand. When land finally appeared on the horizon, Japan, home, everything they'd dreamed of during captivity, the women did not cheer. They stood at the rail in silence, looking at the scarred coastline, the destroyed ports, the evidence of total defeat. This was the Japan they'd return to. Not the Japan they'd left. Not the Japan of their memories. But this broken, occupied, defeated nation, trying to rise from its own ashes. Yuki returned to Tokyo and found her family alive, but living in poverty, in a makeshift shelter. Her father looked at her with a mixture of relief and something she couldn't quite name. Shame? Confusion? She was alive and healthy while so many had died. How could he process that? She never spoke much about her captivity. When neighbors asked, she said only that she'd been treated according to international law. She didn't mention the blankets, the tea, the chocolate, the care. These memories were too complex to share with people who'd suffered so differently. But she kept her diary. Decades later, when her own daughter was grown, Yuki finally showed it to her. Her daughter read the entries with tears streaming down her face. "You were treated kindly by the enemy?" she asked. Yuki nodded. "Sometimes the enemy is more human than your own side. That's one of the hardest lessons of war." Ko lived to be 87. In her final years, she spoke more openly about her experiences. She told her grandchildren, "They treated us like we mattered. Not because they liked us, not because we deserved it, but because they believed certain rules should not be broken, even in war. That belief saved my life and my soul. It taught me that civilization isn't about who wins. It's about what you refuse to do, even when you have the power to do it. And so the blankets and tea became more than simple comforts on a cold night. They became symbols of something larger, the idea that even in the midst of the most terrible war in human history, humanity could persist. That rules mattered, that dignity mattered, that how you treat people, even enemy people, defines who you are more than whether you win or lose. For those 47 Japanese women, the night the Americans brought blankets instead of violence became the central memory of the war. Not the battles, not the defeat, not even the atomic bombs, but that moment when their expectations of horror met the reality of basic human decency. When the enemy they'd been taught to fear showed them that the real divide in the world isn't between nations, but between those who hold on to their humanity even in war, and those who let it slip away. As Yuki wrote in the final entry of her diary, years after the war, "We prepared for death and received life. We prepared for cruelty and received care. We prepared to face monsters and met human beings. The blankets were warm, but the lesson was harder and colder. We had been lied to about everything. And yet from those lies, we learned the most important truth, that enemies can show mercy, and mercy is the greatest victory of all." That's the story worth remembering. If you found this account meaningful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These stories of World War II, the ones that show complicated truths about humanity in its darkest moments, deserve to be preserved and shared. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's a blanket and a cup of tea on a cold night. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story from history.